All right, in part two of this chapter, we'll talk a little bit more about some concepts and strategies in investment planning. Again, keeping in mind that this is a very cursory view of investment theory and investment planning in general. Essentially, there's three things you want to have as objectives in investments. You are investing for liquidity purposes, for current income, or for investment growth. And what makes investment planning so complex is that different desires of different people have different needs. So it's quite possible that you could have investment vehicles that are doing all three of these things at the same time. So you have three different types of strategies, three needs that you have. So it makes things very complex. The concept of asset allocation basically gives us a system, if you will, of trying to diversify a portfolio across three basic asset classes to try to maximize the possible portfolio returns within a given level of risk that's acceptable to the client. So in this process, though, it's obviously very important to differentiate between different asset classes. And even within classes, for instance, in a stock class, we have to be able to differentiate between those things that are growth-oriented and those things that are value-oriented. Those things that are primarily interested in producing capital gains and wealth appreciation, and those things that might be more geared towards income orientation. Certainly we have to worry about taxes, right? I mean, there are essentially three different tax categories, if you will, of investments. Some taxes will be fully taxable. Upon earning a return, the tax essentially is due. Now, we don't pay the tax as we go for investments, but every year when you file your income taxes, that is accumulated and the actual taxes assessed at that point. We could have tax that's tax deferred, or items where income is tax deferred. These are our retirement planning and our education planning tools, where we're going to move the tax that we may ultimately be paid might be ultimately moved to a later date. Tax sheltered is where we make combinations of investments with our current income, so that these current investments will shelter some of our current salaries, wages, etc. from taxation. And of course, tax-free means there's no tax paid. And where we talked about tax deferred, and I mentioned education planning, of course, education planning done properly is not just tax deferred, but it is also tax free. There are also retirement planning tools called Roth vehicles that are both tax deferred and then ultimately tax free. So in the end, what we want to do is try to find returns that are going to minimize the tax consequences of the returns. In other words, maximize after-tax returns. Figure out a way how I can create a pile of money so that I can keep the most of that I possibly can for my own personal use. Time is obviously of importance. The longer the time frame, the riskier a person can be. Certainly our product choices will be shaped by the ultimate time remaining. Maybe some investments will actually be classified as short-term, medium-term, long-term, and we'll be able to determine which asset classes best fit those. But again, in the end, we have to understand what is the difference between investments, taxes, and the time that it takes for these investments to ultimately work for us rather than working for somebody else. Risk and return are positively related. It's hard to imagine how a person could get a greater level of return without taking on some more risks. Return is the compensation that you get for taking risk. So planners ultimately should try to select products that are going to optimize portfolio return given the level of risk. To do that, the first thing we need to do is to measure risk tolerance, which is a fairly objective measure. We're going to have to assess what a person actually feels or how they're acting with respect to risk tolerances so that we can understand what kind of a portfolio to build for them. Investors need to be able to prioritize their goals. This is very difficult for investors. They have an idea of what they want to do, but sometimes what they want to do is not categorized in a way that is best for them in the long term. Frequently, the things that we ignore are things like emergency funds, retirement planning, children's education, maybe just some other general potential needs that we may have. We frequently put those things aside and put in their place what investors perceive as being higher prioritized items. So again, we have to be able to identify what those are. This is really a massive communication effort. We have to communicate and understand how they feel, so in the end we can help create a portfolio that will match their goals, it will meet their target investment portfolio. Again, we've already talked about risk and return. Again, this is actually just another slide. It's the exact same slide actually, but we need to kind of emphasize that risk is very difficult, right? It changes as we change. It changes with our age. It changes with our wealth. It changes with our knowledge, our sophistication. All of those things ultimately have an impact on how we feel about risk. We need to understand something about my predisposition towards certain kinds of products. Right now, currently, there are some issues with stocks, right? Many people are very leery of stocks now because stocks have tended to be fairly volatile over the last couple of years. So again, we have to understand, right, what makes a person think the way they think. What are the things that have happened to them in the past that are driving them in a certain direction? And this is very difficult to do. It takes a little bit of time and certainly a lot of meetings to get to know somebody before you can adequately express what their preferences might be. And then finally, we have to figure out what's the portfolio going to look like. We need to have some cash reserves. We need to have some kind of a plan that potentially will provide some income flow. Certainly, we're looking for growth opportunities and long-term growth. We're also looking for things that would ultimately have some tax advantages. So we need to look at tax-deferred items. We need to look at real estate investments since they have some potential tax advantages. But there's lots of there's not just growth. There's growth looking to build wealth, but there's also growth that is geared more towards retirement planning. So ultimately, in the end, we want to create some type of a target investment portfolio. Something that portrays my current needs today. Now, every year or so, I have to take that picture again. And we have to do it over and over and over again as we work our way through our life cycle, which obviously assumes then our changing needs, changing objectives, changing desires.